It was a warm summer morning when young Daniel set out, his heart racing with both excitement and a touch of fear. He had lived all his life in a small, quiet town tucked between rolling hills and calm rivers. But today, Daniel was finally leaving that comfort, eager to explore the world beyond, to find adventure, and maybe a little bit of himself. He was 18, with wide, curious eyes and a restless spirit that always longed for something more. Daniel's father, a quiet man with eyes worn by years of hard work, stood at the gate as Daniel packed the last of his belongings. He didn't say much, only offering a firm handshake and a soft pat on his shoulder. They shared a silent moment, a father's quiet blessing and a son's unspoken promise to return. "Stay safe, son," his father said in a voice that trembled slightly, though Daniel barely noticed. With a final wave to his father and mother, Daniel set off down the dusty path that led out of town, the warm morning sun casting long shadows as he went. His journey began with a few simple goals: to see the world, to learn more about himself, and to find answers to questions he'd had for as long as he could remember. As he walked, the familiar landscape gave way to a more open, endless horizon. Fields of wildflowers waved in the gentle breeze, and birds sang from nearby trees. With every step, Daniel felt more alive, as though each mile was unraveling a hidden part of his soul. But, as he walked further, doubts began to creep into his mind. Would he find what he was looking for? Could he manage on his own, away from the guidance and safety of his family? These thoughts were faint whispers, easily drowned out by the thrill of his adventure. After a day's journey, Daniel arrived in a small village nestled by a river. The villagers were friendly, offering him bread and water, and in return, he shared stories of his town and his dreams of exploring the unknown. They listened with wide eyes and kind smiles, reminding Daniel of his own family. That night he slept under the stars, feeling the comforting hum of nature around him. As dawn approached, a strange sense of loneliness crept into Daniel's heart. The village was still asleep, and he lay staring at the sky, wondering if he was truly prepared for this journey. He missed the comfort of his father's steady presence, his mother's warm meals, and even the familiar sounds of his town. A soft sigh escaped his lips as he sat up, watching the stars fade one by one as the sun began to rise. He felt the weight of the journey ahead, suddenly realizing that adventure wasn't just about excitement and freedom. It was also about facing his fears, pushing through loneliness, and understanding the depth of his own heart. Daniel brushed off his feelings, deciding to keep moving. The road stretched ahead, winding between fields and forests, leading him deeper into the unknown. The day grew hot and sweat beaded on his forehead, but he pressed on, determined to reach the mountains that lay beyond. As Daniel trekked further, the mountains rose like ancient giants in the distance, their snow-capped peaks piercing the blue sky. Each day brought new challenges, tiring stretches of road, sudden storms, and unexpected obstacles. But it was these trials that seemed to draw out a deeper resilience within him. On the third night, while resting beside a quiet brook, Daniel met a young girl named Elara. She was scrappy, with dirt-smudged cheeks and a wild grin, and she had an energetic dog named Bruno trailing by her side. "What's a lad like you doing out here alone?" she asked, tossing him a lopsided smile. "Looking for adventure," Daniel replied confidently, though a trace of weariness lingered in his voice. Elara raised an eyebrow. "Adventure? There's plenty of that, sure. But it can be dangerous. You don't look like you've been through much yet. She teased him playfully, but her words carried a hint of warning. Still, Daniel found himself laughing, and for the first time in days, he felt lighter. They swapped stories by the fire, and as the night wore on, he learned that Elara was on her way to the same mountain pass he planned to cross. They decided to travel together, knowing that the journey would be more bearable with company. The days they spent traveling together turned into a delightful mix of mishaps and laughter. One evening, Elara dared Daniel to climb a tree to get a rare, magic fruit she'd spotted. Daniel, eager to impress, scrambled up the tree, only to find that the so-called fruit was actually an old bird's nest. When he climbed down, covered in scratches and twigs, Elara laughed so hard she fell over, clutching her stomach. "Magic fruit indeed," she chuckled. "You're one brave fool, Daniel." Their laughter echoed through the forest, and the coldness of the journey seemed to fade in their shared humor. Yet beneath the banter, Daniel sensed a depth in Elara, a quiet determination, and a history she kept hidden. Sometimes, in quiet moments by the fire, he noticed a faraway look in her eyes, as if she, too, carried her own burdens. On the 5th day, they encountered an old man struggling with a broken cart along the road. His horse was weary, and he looked both frail and exhausted. Without hesitation, Daniel and Elara helped him, spending hours pushing and pulling the cart to a nearby village. By the time they were finished, Daniel's muscles ached and he could barely stand. The old man, deeply grateful, pressed a small amulet into Daniel's hand. "It's for protection," he said, his eyes full of sincerity. "You're good folk, and you'll need all the help you can get on these roads." As they waved goodbye, Daniel noticed Elara wiping her eyes. She laughed it off, saying, "Oh, don't look so surprised. Even I have a heart." That night, Daniel thought about the old man's words, clutching the amulet tightly as he drifted off to sleep. The journey had taken on a new depth for him, revealing that adventure wasn't only about thrills, it was about kindness too, and the quiet strength it took to help others along the way. After a week of traveling together, they reached a high mountain pass. The air was thin, and their steps grew heavier with each mile. That night, as they camped near the peak, Elara finally opened up. She told Daniel about her family, a small farm lost to debt and taken over by strangers. She had left with nothing, hoping to find work and send money home. Daniel listened, feeling a pang of compassion he hadn't expected. He had left home freely, with love and support. Elara's journey, however, was one born of desperation, sacrifice, and survival. "You've been so strong," Daniel said softly, marveling at her resilience. Elara smiled, but her eyes glistened. Strong isn't a choice when it's all you have. They sat in silence for a while, gazing out at the vast, dark sky. Daniel felt a surge of resolve. He promised himself he would be the friend Elara deserved, one who would stand by her through whatever lay ahead. The next morning, they started their descent down the mountain. The trail was narrow, the rocks loose and slick from the previous night's rain. They moved slowly, each step carefully placed. But as they rounded a corner, the ground gave way beneath Elara, and she slid down a steep slope, clutching at branches and rocks to slow her fall. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice filled with panic. Heart pounding, Daniel scrambled down after her, throwing his weight against a rock to brace himself. He reached for her, his hand outstretched, his own breath shallow with fear. "Take my hand, Elara," he yelled, his voice strained. She hesitated, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, but then she reached out, grasping his hand tightly. With a final heave, Daniel pulled her to safety, and they collapsed together on the trail, breathing heavily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The shock hung thick in the air, the reality of the danger sinking in. Then, in a hushed voice, Elara whispered, "Thank you, Daniel. You saved my life." After that, they walked more cautiously, their bond stronger, forged by shared struggles and a newfound respect for each other's courage. Elara, once quick with sarcasm, softened around Daniel. She began to open up more, sharing stories of her childhood and the little hopes she still held on to. Daniel, too, felt himself changing, maturing with each step. His initial carefree attitude replaced by a deeper sense of purpose. As they reached the next town, they spent a few days working to earn money for supplies. Daniel learned to fish, and Elara taught him to sew a basic stitch, laughing at his clumsy attempts. It was hard work, but their laughter filled the air as they stumbled through their tasks together. One evening, after a long day of work, Elara found Daniel sitting by the river, lost in thought. "Do you ever think about going back home?" she asked, her voice gentle. Daniel sighed, looking down at his hands. "I used to think I wanted to see the whole world, to experience everything it had to offer. But now, I don't know. I miss my family, my home. I thought I had to leave to find myself, but maybe who I am has always been there." Elara nodded, understanding. Sometimes the journey isn't about finding something new. It's about realizing what you've had all along. They sat together in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with colors of gold and crimson. The journey was teaching Daniel not just about the world, but about his own heart. The next day, as they were packing up to leave, a loud honking noise startled them. They turned to see a scruffy old goat sniffing at their bags. Before they could stop it, the goat snagged a corner of Elara's blanket and tried to munch on it. "Oh no, you don't!" Elara shouted, swatting at the goat. Daniel burst out laughing as Elara chased the goat around in circles, trying to save her blanket. Finally, she managed to retrieve her blanket, shaking her fist at the mischievous creature as it trotted away, looking quite pleased with itself. "If I ever see that goat again," she muttered, trying to hide a smile. Daniel chuckled, feeling the warmth of their friendship wrap around him like a comforting blanket. Moments like these reminded him that joy could be found even in the most unexpected places. As they approached the last stretch of their journey together, a decision loomed over them. They'd heard of a faster route that cut through a dense forest, known for wild animals and unpredictable paths. While it was risky, it would shave off days of travel. "We don't have to do this," Daniel said, feeling the weight of the choice. "We can take the safer route." Elara squared her shoulders, her eyes set with determination. "I can't afford more time, Daniel. My family needs me." Without another word, she started down the forest path. Daniel hesitated, but his loyalty to Elara drove him forward. The forest was dark and thick, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant animal calls. Every sound set their nerves on edge, but they pushed on, hearts racing. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees. A pair of golden eyes appeared in the shadows, watching them with deadly intent. It was a wolf, sleek and silent, prowling closer with each passing second. Elara's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, But Daniel stepped forward, gripping a branch as he held his ground. The wolf watched him, its gaze cold and calculating. For a moment, they were locked in a standoff, and then with a snarl, the wolf turned and melted back into the shadows. They stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "That was too close," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel nodded, feeling a rush of relief mixed with pride. They had faced danger together, and together they had made it through. As they reached the edge of the forest and looked back one last time, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The journey had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't the same young man who had left home seeking adventure. He had discovered strength, resilience, and above all, the power of friendship. Elara gave him a soft smile, understanding his thoughts. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He smiled back, their bond forever forged by the journey they had shared. As they emerged from the dense forest, Daniel and Elara found themselves on a quiet hill overlooking a sprawling valley bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. For a moment, they stood in awe, both exhausted yet filled with a shared sense of accomplishment. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might break the spell. Elara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did." She turned to Daniel, her face softened with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this alone." They set up camp for the night, enjoying the peace of the open sky above them, the stars appearing one by one as the twilight faded. They sat by the fire, wrapped in their own thoughts, the crackling flames filling the silence. After a while, Elara spoke, her voice barely audible over the soft crackling of the fire. "You know, I was scared, back there in the forest. I really thought it was the end." Daniel, who had been gazing into the fire, looked up. "Me too, but it wasn't. We made it through." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You taught me something, Elara. I used to think courage was about not feeling afraid. But now I know. It's about pushing through fear, even when it feels impossible." Elara gave a small, grateful smile. "I'm glad you see it that way, Daniel. Sometimes, I still feel like the frightened girl who left home because she had no choice. But with you, it feels different. I feel braver." They shared a quiet moment, two travelers bound by shared trials and unspoken admiration. Daniel felt a swell of pride for Elara and a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. He vowed silently to see this journey through, not just for himself, but for her too. The next morning, they packed up their belongings, preparing to continue their journey. Just as they were about to set off, they heard a familiar honking noise. Out of the brush trotted the same mischievous goat from days ago, with Elara's blanket dangling from its mouth. Elara gasped, her hands flying to her hips. "You again. Give that back." Daniel laughed as Elara chased the goat, who seemed delighted to lead her on a wild chase around the hillside. Eventually she managed to snatch her blanket back, muttering under her breath, "If I ever see that goat again." Daniel couldn't hold back his laughter, and soon Elara joined in, the tension of the previous days melting into shared humor. They both knew that these moments of levity were precious, brightening the more difficult parts of their journey. After hours of walking, they came to a fork in the road. One path led down into the valley, while the other climbed steeply into the mountains, where clouds seemed to swirl around the peaks like whispered secrets. A signpost lay broken on the ground, its words worn and illegible. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, looking at Elara. Elara studied the mountain path, a glint of excitement in her eyes. I think this journey is about more than taking the easy road. She turned to him, her smile both daring and uncertain. What do you say? Daniel felt a rush of excitement. They were tired, but this wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the experiences they'd gather along the way. With a nod, he followed Elara up the mountain path. The ascent was steep and treacherous, each step testing their endurance. But the higher they climbed, the more spectacular the view became, as if nature itself was rewarding their courage. Elara pointed out shapes in the clouds, and they laughed, letting their imaginations run wild. It was an unspoken promise to each other. They would face the unknown together. That evening, as they huddled by a small fire under the shelter of a rocky overhang, Daniel noticed Elara shivering. He moved closer, offering her the extra blanket. You're freezing, he said, concern filling his voice. Elara took the blanket with a grateful nod, but her face was tense. After a pause, she spoke, her voice hesitant. Daniel, there's something I haven't told you. He looked at her, his brow furrowed in curiosity. I wasn't just running from my debts, she admitted, her voice wavering. I left because I couldn't handle watching my family struggle. My father fell ill and we had nothing. I left to ease the burden, but every step I took felt like betrayal. I can't help wondering if I abandoned them. Daniel's heart tightened with empathy. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Elara, sometimes we leave to become stronger for the ones we love. You didn't abandon them. You're fighting for them. Tears glistened in Elara's eyes, and she gave him a small, grateful nod. Thank you, Daniel. You have no idea what that means to me. In that quiet moment, they found solace in each other, their friendship deepened by vulnerability and shared dreams of home. Just as they were beginning to relax, a sudden rumbling echoed through the mountains. The ground beneath them trembled, and rocks began to roll down the hillside. They leapt to their feet, grabbing their belongings and scrambling for cover as a landslide roared down the mountain. Elara? Daniel shouted, his voice laced with urgency. They raced down the trail, dodging falling rocks and loose debris. Daniel's heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder, making sure Elara was close behind. A large boulder crashed into the path mere feet from where she stood, and he felt a surge of terror. Finally, they reached a safe spot, panting and clutching each other in sheer relief. Dust hung in the air, and they coughed, shaking as the adrenaline coursed through them. Elara broke into nervous laughter, her eyes wide with disbelief. Just when I thought this journey couldn't get any crazier. Daniel joined in, their laughter ringing through the mountains, a defiant sound against the danger they had just escaped. They were alive, and that was enough. As they resumed their journey the following day, they encountered a mysterious old woman sitting on a stone near a small shrine. She had eyes like embers and a presence that commanded respect. Without a word, she gestured for them to sit beside her. Travelers, she said in a low, gravelly voice, the road you walk is not for the faint of heart. Daniel and Elara exchanged curious glances. I sense much in you, she continued, her gaze piercing. Courage, compassion, and a love that transcends mere companionship. They looked at each other, embarrassed yet intrigued. Remember, the woman said, true strength lies not in the miles you travel, but in the kindness you show and the love you hold. She reached into a pouch and handed them a small charm woven from red string and dried flowers. For luck, you'll need it. They thanked her, touched by the encounter, and as they walked away they felt the weight of her words settling in their hearts. That night, as they camped in a narrow gorge, a fierce storm blew in. Rain poured down in torrents and thunder rumbled overhead. They scrambled to keep their fire going, but the wind howled, whipping their belongings around. "Hold the tarp, quick!" Daniel yelled, struggling to secure their shelter. In the chaos, their bags toppled over, spilling their supplies. They gathered what they could, their hands numb from the cold rain. When the storm finally subsided, they were left wet, exhausted, and with very few supplies. Elara looked at their ruined provisions, her face tense. "How are we supposed to keep going?" Daniel's resolve hardened. He placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. "We'll make it, together. We always have." With a deep breath, she nodded, a new determination lighting her eyes. Despite their hardships, they knew they could rely on each other. It wasn't just words anymore, it was trust built from experience. As they descended from the mountain, they came across a small cabin nestled in a grove of trees. An elderly couple welcomed them, offering warm tea and a cozy place to rest. They listened to Daniel and Elara's stories, chuckling at the tales of their mishaps and admiring their resilience. Before they left, the old man handed them a carefully wrapped bundle. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, dried meat, and a small jar of honey. "You're strong," he said, his voice warm, "but even the strongest need a little kindness now and then." They accepted the gift, their hearts swelling with gratitude. The journey ahead was still long, but they had found strength in unexpected places and the kindness of strangers. As they continued their journey, a sense of foreboding began to settle over them. The charm given to them by the old woman seemed to pulse in Daniel's pocket, almost as if it was trying to warn him. He glanced at Elara, who seemed lost in thought, her face etched with determination and the traces of their journey's hardships. The next stretch of road led into a dark forest, dense with towering trees that seemed to close in around them. An eerie silence filled the air, broken only by the distant calls of crows. "Elara," Daniel whispered, feeling a chill. "Do you think we're ready for whatever comes next?" She took a deep breath, her hand brushing against his. "Yes, Daniel. We've come this far. No matter what lies ahead, we face it together." And with that, they stepped forward into the shadows, hearts steady and spirits intertwined, ready for whatever the journey still had in store for them. As Daniel and Elara stepped into the mysterious forest, a quiet but unbreakable bond bound them together. They had faced dangers, laughter, loss, and friendship, each moment etching itself into their hearts. Now, a greater adventure awaited them, one that promised to test everything they had learned and everything they had become. But their journey doesn't end here. The story of Daniel and Elara continues, filled with challenges that will push them to new heights and mysteries waiting to be unraveled. What awaits them in the depths of the forest? How will they face the trials that lie ahead? To find out what happens next, subscribe to Easy English Class and stay tuned for more exciting stories, language tips, and adventures that not only teach English, but connect us all through the art of storytelling. Join us, and let's continue the journey together.